Some IPs are a result of calculated planning, while others a blend of incidental genius and original design. Apart from these, there are also IPs that establish entire genres purely by accident, like Capcom's Devil May Cry. Sure, the slasher subgenre of third-person action games might not be as popular as it was back in the day, but you can't deny its influence on mainstream titles. And seeing that series that were inspired by DMC like God of War or Bayonetta are making a comeback this year, one has to wonder, where is Dante? Well, for some time rumors have been circulating around the web that a new Devil May Cry is being made, and Hideki Kamiya's recent tweets have been adding fuel to fan speculation. So let's take a look back at the series and see where it might be headed in the new installment. The first Devil May Cry game was a PS2 exclusive that came out in 2001 and was one of the best games on the system around its launch. Surprisingly, it's not like Capcom set out to create a brand new series from the get-go, but rather, it was a result of Resident Evil 4's troubled development. Hideki Kamiya, one of the creators of the early Resident Evil games, was tasked with making the fourth installment in the franchise, but his vision was far from the atmospheric survival horror we fell in love with back in the PS1 era. Kamiya's concept for the new game involved fast-paced action, bioengineering, and a mutated superhuman protagonist, Tony Redgrave. And if that's not the edgiest name ever, I don't know what is. While Kamiya's idea for the new game was, well, quite unique, it didn't suit the Resident Evil brand, so instead of being scrapped altogether, the project was soon greenlit by Capcom, but as an entirely new IP. Soon after, Tony became Dante, a half-human, half-devil mercenary, the number of enemies drastically increased, and the science fiction-like plot about biotechnology made room for a neo-gothic tale about killing demons. The gameplay was fast and, while quite demanding at times, greatly satisfying. And it wasn't only style over substance either. Thanks to a unique character progression system, we bought power-ups and new combos to master. The first Devil May Cry game was overall good, and the audiovisual side has also aged well. Apart from that, it was much more grim and atmospheric than future over-the-top installments.
I came here to seek your help, to put an end to the underworld.
What?
Naturally though, the game had some flaws like bad voice acting, flat characters and a mediocre plot, but not many people cared about that as the core gameplay was greatly enjoyable.
Devil May Cry 2.
Even though the series' debut was a large success, the 2003 sequel, Devil May Cry 2, proved that it was really easy to spoil the game's formula. Dante wasn't as interesting as before, Lucia, the second playable character, was simply meh, we got to face possessed military equipment, which still to this day makes me cringe, and the gothic castle was swapped for a modern but less detailed setting. You didn't have to watch the end credits to know that Kamiya, for reasons unknown, was not involved with the project, and that's probably the cause for the game's mediocrity. All in all, it wasn't the misfire of the artistic direction that made Devil May Cry 2 the least favorite game among the fans, but rather the difficulty level. The game was simply too easy. The original Devil May Cry struck a perfect balance between satisfying and demanding. It was easy to get our asses handed to us, but when we tried to master the fighting system, practice a bit and improved our reflexes, every boss quickly became our bitch. And that's the essence of Devil May Cry that makes it so much fun, and that component was sadly missing from the second game. Lucky for us though, the forgettable sequel didn't kill the series, and the next installment surpassed all of our expectations.
Devil May Cry.
Halfway through the troubled production of Devil May Cry 2, Hideaki Itsuno became the game's director, and even though the end result was disappointing, Itsuno retained his position while working on the next chapter of Dante's adventures. Itsuno made up for the second game with 2005's Devil May Cry 3, Dante's Awakening, which was in fact the series' prequel. Featuring a much more sassy and arrogant, younger incarnation of Dante, the game went back to the series' gothic roots and, most importantly, increased the difficulty level and expanded upon the combat. The game's over-the-top antics might have been too much for some, but it couldn't deny that at its core, Devil May Cry was better than ever. Even though the series isn't known for best storytelling, this time around, while not Academy Award worthy, the game told a satisfying and coherent story about the conflict of the devilish brothers and introduced us to Virgil, Dante's evil katana-wielding twin. The third DMC also gave us the best supporting female character in the series, Lady, because just like James Bond, it seems as if Dante needs to have a new girlfriend in every installment. Dante's Awakening was also special in regards to how it was released. Soon after the first version of the game hit store shelves, we got the special edition in 2006, which apart from offering a few gameplay tweaks and Virgil as a playable character, also marks the first time Devil May Cry was not a Sony exclusive, as it also came out on the PC. And to be honest, this PC port, which was riddled with control issues and other problems, is probably the only bad thing about Dante's Awakening, which to this day is probably the best game in the series. While the Devil May Cry trilogy was being released, Dante was slowly becoming a household name and was featured in other games and media. Most notably, he was a boss in Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne and a playable character in Capcom's Beautiful Joe. Next to that, he even got his own anime series in 2007, courtesy of Madhouse. And well, while the art style was certainly good, the show itself was overall boring and had hardly any memorable action scenes, and the reviews and the overall score at myanimelist.com seem to reflect that. Although I have to admit, DMC the anime had one of the best openings ever, good enough to listen on its own while playing the game. In 2008, Dante came back in Devil May Cry 4, sort of. Now he was set up as a villain, and while we got to play as him in the later half of the game, we started off our adventure as a brand new character. And well, Nero, he wasn't bad, considering that up until the third game, Dante also was a rather stiff character himself, but god, was Nero annoying at times. I don't know if it's the script or the voice acting, which was done by Johnny Bosch, the second Black Power Ranger and Ichigo from the English dub of Bleach.
You aren't human, are you?
Anyway, Nero was essentially a more serious and emotional Dante, but with a demonic arm that expanded his moveset a bit, and that's it. My complaining aside, DMC4 was a good follow-up to the previous game, the combat could be challenging, the gameplay was fun and diverse, and overall, it seemed as if Capcom had a bigger budget this time around. Sadly though, halfway through the game, when we finally got to play as Dante, it turned out that we had to repeat all the bosses and all the levels we previously finished as Nero, and even though backtracking was nothing new to hardened DMC fans, in this particular case, it was downright annoying and it seemed as if Capcom had run out of ideas when scripting the game. Nevertheless, it was a really good game and a good Devil May Cry. Small tweaks to the gameplay and minor additions, like being able to switch fighting styles on the fly, while seemingly insignificant at first, were really useful and made for the most polished fighting system in the series' history.
My name is Dante.
Apart from backtracking, DMC4 expanded upon almost every gameplay aspect of the series, and was almost as fun and as addictive as the nearly perfect third chapter. Still, it seemed that Capcom took some of its criticism too hard and decided to reboot the franchise. The new Devil May Cry, simply called DMC, was developed by the British Ninja Theory of Enslaved and Heavenly Sword fame. The new adventure of Dante divided the fanbase as soon as the first videos were released. The new version of Son of Sparta was much more punkish and had an emo haircut that many fans utterly hated. After the backlash, Ninja Theory took their Dante to the barbershop to get his hair shorter and soon proved that, at least gameplay-wise, there was nothing to be worried about. DMC the Reboot came out in early 2013, and while welcomed with really good reviews, it was still polarizing to the fans. Many people instantly fell in love with the game's art style and the hard electronic soundtrack that got our blood pumping, but some were still underwhelmed as the combat, while enjoyable, wasn't as deep as before and was a bit too easy. And well, although a valid criticism, I wouldn't consider DMC inferior to the previous games in any way, it's just a bit different, and as it was established that it's not canon, who cares? The juggles worked different, and weapon-specific enemies were a chore among many things, but it was still fun, challenging and satisfying as hell, and for me, that's exactly what a Devil May Cry game should be. Apart from that, it finally had a good story that made sense, and platforming that worked and wasn't utterly boring. Sadly though, it didn't meet Capcom's sales expectations, and seeing that Ninja Theory went on to do projects of a smaller budget, it's unlikely that we'll see a continuation of the emo Dante. As of now, it's been 5 years since the release of DMC, and apart from re-releases of previous games, we haven't heard from the Demon Slayer since. So is it the end? Don't bet on it. Apart from cameos in fighting games like Marvel vs. Capcom or Project X Zone, Capcom assures us that Dante isn't dead and we'll see him sooner or later in a big game. And in that case, it seems that the first option is more likely. A leak from last year's November informs us that Devil May Cry 5 is in fact in production. Next to that, there were also rumors that the game was going to be one of the surprise announcements of the last Video Game Awards. And well, none of them turned out to be true. However, it is still very likely that we will see the game at this year's E3. According to an anonymous source, the game will take place just after the 4th installment, offer a much more open world and 3 playable characters, among which Dante and Nero are the most likely to appear. Is that a reason to be excited? Well, not quite if you ask me. Slasher games dipped in popularity for a reason. Despite being visually stunning and action-packed, the trends change over time, and now the AAA segment of our industry is dominated by sandboxes, and there simply seems to be no much room for single-player, linear action games of the past. Take a look at God of War, for example, one of the franchises that, at least gameplay-wise, was greatly inspired by DMC. This spring, Kratos is supposed to return, but the new game about the Greek with anger management issues seems to be more like Ninja Theory's Hellblade rather than a typical DMC-like slasher, and will put more emphasis on narrative than ever before. Because it has to. Next to that, we also have Bayonetta, which, while surpassing DMC in almost every aspect, would have almost died out after the first installment if it wasn't for Nintendo, who wanted to finance the second game and thus granting it cult following that made the announcement of the third title possible. Unfortunately, even though the first Bayonetta was a phenomenal slasher, it didn't sell that well. So how will the next Devil May Cry not repeat Bayonetta's mistakes? Well, as the rumors have it, with an open world. And while that will certainly win over the mainstream audience, it might do the series more harm than good. One of the best elements of the first and the third game were much more smaller, more confined areas which forced us to play smart and fully utilize our arsenal. Devil May Cry 2 on the other hand had big open locations, but they were simply too boring in comparison to combat. If the next DMC will go open world, it might go really bad really fast because, as DMC 3 proved, the best thing about the series is non-stop action and as few moments of filler in between as possible. The same goes for the rumored multiple characters. Sure, that's nothing new to the series, but only if the same level of care is put into all of them. Every time I hear multiple characters in a slasher, I see a Musou game like Sengoku Basara or Dynasty Warriors that choose quantity over quality, offering often cookie-cutter characters with only a handful of moves, while DMC was always about gradually expanding our moveset and perfecting how we handle one character, Dante. And last but not least, there's also this rumor concerning Nero. And oh god, please, just don't. Nevertheless, those are my minor fears based only on a handful of rumors that might not even be true in the end. As of now, Capcom seems to be doing really well with their older franchises. Take Resi 7 for example. At first we were terrified seeing which direction the series was headed, but then we got one of the best games in the series. So all in all, I am positive, but I have my doubts about how will the new DMC fit into the current landscape of AAA games. And to be honest, I don't think the series really needs to come back, at least not if it would mean breaking the hearts of its fans and striding away from the series roots. So prove me wrong, Capcom. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you soon.